Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm Director of the Program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on current developments in Tajikistan, the ongoing sweeping and extremely harsh crackdown on Pamiris, causes behind it, the circumstances this crisis is unfolding in, domestic and external factors, and we will try to discern potential trajectories of Tajikistan's political development. And we have a great panel with us to tackle these difficult questions. We have Dr. Suzanne Levy-Sanchez with us, who is a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And last year, she was a non-resident fellow at American University School of International Service. She's also retired tenured associate professor of National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval War College. She's the author of a number of books, including The Afghan Central Asia Borderlands, the state and local leaders, published by Routledge in 2017. She's the author of the book Bridging State and Civil Society, Informal Organizations in Tajik Afghan Badakhshan, published last year by University of Michigan Press, and I have it with me here, and I would highly recommend people interested in the region to read it. And her new book, Fieldwork as Craft, a Practical Guide to Doing Research in the Real World, will be published next year by Rowman and Littlefield International. Thank you, Suzanne, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Bruce Panier with us, who doesn't need an introduction, but I will do it anyways. He is a longtime journalist and correspondent covering Central Asia. He's the author of Central Asia in Focus, a Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty weekly newsletter, focusing on key events shaping the course of the region. And if you're not subscribing to it, I would encourage you to subscribe to it. He's also the host of the Majlis podcast that I listen to religiously myself. So I think it would be really, really good to plug this in here as well. Prior to joining Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in 1997, Bruce worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague. And throughout the 90s, he lived in villages in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And I think few people on this planet know the region better than Bruce. Thank you for joining us today. And we also have Steve Sverdlov, who will be joining us shortly. He is a human rights lawyer and associate professor of the practice of human rights in the Department of Political and International Relations at the University of Southern California. He is a human rights lawyer and expert on the former Soviet region, teaching international human rights law, human rights research and advocacy, and human rights in Central Asia. And Steve was the senior Central Asia researcher at Human Rights Watch from 2010 till 2019. So hope Steve will join us shortly. So let me start with you, Suzanne. Can you give us a brief overview of the situation and your analysis of it? What causes might have, what could have triggered this crisis?
Well, I'm going to offer a brief timeline to lead into some of the causes. For those many who probably don't know exactly what happened in Gorno-Badakhshan precisely, on November 25th, Gulbuddin Ziyabekov was shot and killed by security forces. Why was he killed? He was killed allegedly because he had beaten up a prosecutor who had sexually harassed or assaulted a young woman, and they had demanded an apology publicly from this prosecutor. That occurred in 2020, in February of 2020. But what happened before that is also important. So I'm going to go back just a little bit. In 2018, there were pre-prison trials in which allegedly the in a pre-prison, there are various types of prisons in Tajikistan. There are regular prisons, there are penal colonies, and there are what's called a CISO. And the CISOs are usually the detention centers where prisoners are brought to before they are brought to the regular prison. And usually they are tortured there. They are interrogated and tortured in the CISOs. And so allegedly there were some prisoners that had been brought to the CISOs and tortured. And one of the local leaders, Tolaboy Mbekov, went and had a fight with the governor at the time, Jamshedov. And it then, the president of Tajikistan said, you need to get this place under control. And so this began one of the skirmishes in the area. At that time, the local leaders eventually were brought to Dushanbe for negotiation. After that negotiation, they replaced the governor with Yodgar Faizov. The local leaders were supportive of this replacement, and Yodgar Faizov began that governorship. So in 2020, when the prosecutor was beaten up, Faizov actually mediated and stopped the arrest of Gulbuddin Ziyabekov. Then there was a meeting, allegedly, with Faizov and the president at some point in 2020, and Yodgar Faizov was asked to clear the area once again of the leaders and the hooligans and the traffickers. And he basically said, that's not going on. But because he disagreed, he was replaced. And there are some other factors as well, with the governor, Mirzana Badov, who said, I'm fine clearing the area. Soon after that, Mirzana Badov unleashed the prosecutor, who allegedly Gulbuddin had beaten up for the harassment of this young woman, to exact revenge and arrest Gulbuddin Ziyabekov. And allegedly, Gulbuddin was brought to the car and shot. I do have pictorial evidence of numerous bullet holes in Gulbuddin Ziyabekov's body and extreme torture. So they did not only just shot him, it was much worse than that. So then that happened, and that led to massive protest. And the massive protest went on for a little while until the government agreed to allow a group of local civil society leaders called Commission 44 to work with the government to investigate the murder. Now, this is important because there have been, prior to 2018 and the recent protests, there were conflicts between government and local leaders in 2014 and 2012. Or I shouldn't say conflicts. The government came in and tried to crack down, gain full control, and kill local leaders in 2014 and 2012. Both of those times, civil society leaders convened. The Aga Khan Development Network and AKF intervened as well. And then there was a mediation that occurred in an investigation and various agreements. So everybody thought really this Commission 44 was going to be this same typical calm down. Instead, it wasn't. And in about February, not exactly sure on the dates, the government of Tajikistan closed the case, which then led to more unrest. I can't remember the exact month, and I don't know if you know, Bruce, but we'll say it's around that time. And also at that same time, Amruddin Avzat Shoyev, I think is how you pronounce his last name, I apologize, was extradited from Russia. And that was a few days before the war in Ukraine started, that first extradition. Then we get to May 2022, where protests began again over the fact that Gulbuddin Ziyabekov's killing was not investigated and there had not been justice brought to him. So that was May 14th through May 16th. On May 18th, Olfat Khanum was arrested, who was part of Commission 44, the journalist and human rights defender, Olfat Khanum Mamashayeva. And that began the arrest of the entire Commission 44, which had been a government-sanctioned civil society group to mediate, which was very alarming to everybody involved. Then a few days later, there are various stories about why Colonel Bokir turned himself in. I've written about it, but suffice it to say the government killed him. And then they killed two other very important local leaders right after that, Zawir and Khorsan, also in May. And then at that point, that began various other arrests and closures. They started closing businesses. They arrested khalifas. They arrested business leaders. They arrested other human rights defenders. They arrested bloggers, poets, singers. They arrested anybody trying to promote the Pamiri language. They shut down various schools. They shut down most of the mosques, except for the main one where the GKNB, the security service, is posted inside the mosque. They disallowed praying in the home, which is an integral part of the Ismaili religion. They arrested, let's see, I have a whole list here of who they arrested. So I think I should actually go down that list very quickly. Sorry, I had it here. So they arrested all the informal leaders, many of the civil society leaders, the journalists, the human rights defenders, lawyers, business people, athletes, artists, musicians, poets, educators, scholars. And there was allegedly over 40 people tortured during this process. And then we are still documenting those who were tortured in the diaspora who escaped. There are over 500 that have fled between Russia and Tajikistan. I don't know the exact number of the extraditions from Russia to Tajikistan. I remember a number of 22 or so, but it was then, they also started then a little bit later, after they started arresting all these other layers of society. In August, they arrested the Oraz Vazirbekov and Ramzes Vazirbekov, who were key leaders in the Moscow diaspora of the Pamiri community. And then they really started going after those, many who fled the country, some who have disappeared. I've counted a number that were extradited or disappeared, and I've also counted a number of people in Korog who have disappeared. So I think that is the overview, and you can see that as they've arrested these layers of civil society, they've also arrested Mahalla neighborhood leaders, and I think that it's important to understand that it's a very methodical, targeted destruction of the civil society, which will lead eventually to various forms of instability. While, CCTV and, the surveillance that China has provided, I think the Tajik government hopes they will be able to control it. But the leaders such as Muslim Sher Zamanov, who's in prison, or Zoir or Khorsand or Bokir or various others, the Khalifa, they mediated between neighborhoods. They mediated inside neighborhoods. They performed weddings and funerals. And weddings and funerals and these mediations are really important because there's a lot of volunteerism and a lot of donations that go and get administered and shared to families in need and all kinds of things. They don't have those leaders to do that anymore. So the very fabric of the society has been destroyed. They also have banned volunteers from working in the Ismaili Jamaat, which is also a key way in which food and clothing and whatnot is distributed to families in need. And then, since they are arresting many, many heads of households, these heads of households are the ones who support these families. But the prisons don't actually feed the prisoners. They feed them rotten food, from what I understand. So the families have to find a way to get the food to the prison, and they have to bribe the prison guard to give the food to them. They have to, and usually a prison guard, from what I understand, takes part of the food as well. So there's this whole way in which these families and the burdens on these families are getting more and more and more, which is a bit of a crisis. And then if people from the diaspora send money, they're accused of supporting terrorism or fomenting a coup or whatever this money. So it's hard to get the money to the people in Karok who are in need. So there's all kinds of ways in which the government is cracking down. I mean, I'll give you one more specific example before I'll briefly discuss the underlying reasons that I think. There was recently, there's a cafe in a small mahalla in the southwest of the city, and there was a waitress who was speaking Shugni to a young man in the cafe, and a police officer was there and turned to the waitress and just said, "Don't speak that ugly animal language in this cafe." And the young man stood up for her, and then the police officer beat him and said, "I don't want to ever hear you speaking that language again. And if you share this story with anyone, I'm going to put you in prison forever." So that was just for speaking Shugni. That was last week. So the crackdowns continue, and they have gotten more severe. So why did it happen? I think that there are 5 main reasons. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is why, for a long time, the Pamirs had sort of what would be termed a krisha or a roof from Russia. Certain leaders did. And also the head of the GKNB, Yatimov, was also the roof of various leaders. So it wasn't perfect, but there were agreements. And so the local leaders could kind of function within society, and they worked with the government and they worked with Russia. So in February, when Ukraine started, things shifted. That krisha sort of ended. You'll see it really clearly. And recently, last week, there was an arrest in a neighboring main district of Porshnev of alleged, it was a couple weeks ago, but 3 to 8 people. Those 3, Porshnev is the last area of Gorno-Badakhshan that the Tajik government is cracking down on. So they started in the district of Roshkala, then they went to Karok, then they went to Roshan, and really cleared those areas, and now they're in Porshnev. Porshnev is near Afghanistan. The leaders there have a strong network in Afghanistan. I've met those leaders, and they also had a very significant roof or protection and ties with Yatimov and the government, Russia. So why are they cracking down there? That's important as well. So if the Pamirs lost their roof and Yatimov has lost his ability to protect certain people, who's behind this and why? So in 2020, there were between 2018 and 2020, there were rumors that the Tajik president was planning his successor. And that rumor has been percolating now for almost 5 years. And so if that's true, then he had to prove to outside powers that he could control the entire country. Many have said Rustam, his son, Rustam Imamali, is the successor. I have heard through my sources that both China and Putin are not happy with that choice. So there are some tensions there that are going on. But there are also other reasons. With the Kyrgyz-Tajik border fighting and with Uzbekistan closing off a key trafficking route after the after the Taliban takeover, the main trafficking route became the heroin highway or the Pamir highway up through Gorno-Badakhshan to Osh. And that was Colonel Bolkir's neighborhood of Barharog sat right on the access to the Pamir highway. So in speculation, and I can only speculate on this, I want to be very clear, but I would speculate that, I've said this before, China provided CCTV and drones, and it's a very different type of crackdown. This is more of a Chinese crackdown, in my opinion, than a Russian crackdown. And if you think about it through that lens, China wants all those leaders out. They want that road cleared, and they want utter control of the region. And I do believe that's in trade for support. And I do believe that Russia, on some level, agreed to that because they had to, because they needed China's support for Ukraine. I also think that Putin needed Rahmon's support for Ukraine. And so he gave some concessions. For example, Rahmon really wanted Oraz Ziyabekov to be extradited. So I think potentially there was a trade there. So you have the trafficking, you have, and I'm not going to go too deeply right now into Russia and China, and then you have the succession planning. And I think that all that together, the regime has methodically gone through each region to take it over and take control of it. But this is markedly different. It's a complete and utter destruction of the civil society in a methodical manner. So I hope that provides an okay overview.
No, that provides plenty of food for thought and discussions. You drew a very complex picture for us. Let me turn to Bruce. Bruce, what's your take on the situation?
Well, thank you. And let me thank the Harvard Davis Center for the invitation, and thank you, Nargiz. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by talking about the Ziyabekov brothers. And Suzanne has already mentioned them, just because this is kind of it shows the absurdity of this whole campaign, what's going on, and really the government efforts to do that, to do what they're doing, and try to make it look like it's a legitimate process, right? So you had there's two brothers, Oraz and Ramzi, as Suzanne mentioned. They have Russian citizenship. They'd been living in Russia for some time, although they have their own YouTube channel. And after the events Suzanne's described in November 2021, they started airing bits that criticized the what had happened, the injustice that had been done to Pamiris. So they're on a plane from Yekaterinburg to Moscow, to the Domodedovo airport on July 29th, and then they land in Moscow and then vanish. And no one knows where they are until the next day, when all of a sudden they show up and they're in Dushanbe at some local television station is filming them. And Oraz Ziyabekov says they came voluntarily back. They were invited to come and help with the investigation into the May violence that happened in Gabao. And that's why they're there. Of course, they're quickly detained. At the start of November, Oraz was sentenced to 16 years in prison, and his brother Ramzi was sentenced to 13 years in prison. So how did you get from them disappearing and then supposedly voluntarily returning to help with the investigation, and then 3 months later they're in prison for lengthy jail sentence or lengthy sentences? And just that the Tajik government would go to all the trouble to actually film them saying that, we came back to help, shows how, the strange sense of how the Tajik government views being a spin doctor or something, I suppose, how you try to justify this stuff publicly. No one believed it when they said it. The Bazarbekov's relatives were saying it's clearly, faked, and they've been forced to say this under duress, and sure enough, it did. But for what it's worth, the Tajik government actually thought that this was an explanation. That this, at least for a while, would help. And they'd say, no, they're not. We didn't bring them back forcibly. They came back, and they're here to help with our investigation, which was totally ridiculous. And I want to say a few things about the Pamir area. Suzanne covered it great, but let me just fill in a couple other pieces. During the 1992-1997 civil war in Tajikistan, the Pamiris were actually, most of them were in the opposition, the group that was fighting against the Tajik government, the United Tajik Opposition, right? It's the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, the Democratic Party of Tajikistan, and Lali Badakhshan, the Ruby of Badakhshan. So it's kind of a strange umbrella organization, but they fought against the Tajik government. We know that there was a peace deal at the end of in 1997, which was supposed to end all the hostilities and included the fact that members of the opposition would be integrated into the government, and they did have 30% of the seats for a while there. They were supposed to be integrated all the way through, including their fighters if they wanted to join the military. And gradually, over the course of the next 20 years, almost, the Tajik government kind of neutralized all the opposition groups that had opposed them during the civil war, except they never had a really good hold over Gorno-Badakhshan. Gorno-Badakhshan remained the only place in Tajikistan where you could still protest. And I want to be clear about these protests too. No one in Gorno-Badakhshan has ever called for independence. They're not separatists. They never went for that. They in fact, I've talked to many people from there, and they say, no, it's okay that we're part of Tajikistan. That's all right. But we want legitimate representation at a local level anyway. And that's really where all these problems come from, is that you get state-appointed officials out there, even though they're natives of the region, and they don't really pay much attention. Suzanne recounted the story of Gulbuddin Ziyabekov. Now, this is an example where, that for a while, the local leader knew how to talk to people and cut deals so that he could make everything right with that. And this is the kind of person that most people in Gorno-Badakhshan are looking for, someone who's looking out for their interests as well as the state's interests, right? So, but, it is an area that protests still happen. Obviously, this bothered the Tajik government, and President Rahman still carried a grudge from the Civil War days that these guys were members of the opposition. It was an area which wasn't obviously fully under control of the government. So he decides to stage this crackdown. I mean, it went from being a peaceful protest, as so many of these protests have been in Gorno-Badakhshan, right? That they started as peaceful protests, and it's only when security forces try to intervene and disperse the crowd that all of a sudden it turns violent. And in the case of this latest protest in May, it's clear that the security forces initiated all this. I mean, they did start firing on the crowd, tear gas at first and stun grenades, but there was people killed, right away. And they were all among the protesters, not the guards. It wasn't until after that, when things got really bad and fighting started, that actually a few members of the security forces were actually killed as part of that too. But I mean, for the most part, protests in Gorno-Badakhshan have been peaceful. Again, they're not asking for independence. They're not criticizing the government either, not the central government or President Rahman. Nothing. It's always, our people have been detained. There's no proper investigation, into the causes of why, or the charges. We don't like the state-appointed local leader. He doesn't have our best interests at heart. But again, peaceful protests, no call for secession, no call for no criticism or harsh words about the central government in Dushanbe, and so you get this crackdown. And I got to say at this point, that I've been covering Tajikistan since 1995. I've never seen anything like this the whole time. And I mean, obviously since 1995 they were in civil war, so I was watching, and you still didn't get this. That they would target one specific community and just relentlessly go after them. I mean, people have called it cultural genocide. It's almost impossible to argue with that. They really seem to be gutting whatever makes these people unique up there. and I see Steve has joined us too. And I want to keep my comments short so we have time for a Q&A. But one last point I wanted to make is that, the Tajik government is always expressing concerns about the fact that they're next to Afghanistan. There's these extremist groups and the potential for instability that come across the border and everything like that. The groups they're talking about are Sunni extremist groups in Afghanistan. If you wanted a 100% reliable defense of your border, wouldn't it make sense to be friends with the Shiite community of the Pamiris who have everything to lose if these people come across the border? And instead, the Tajik government has resorted to being as bad in their treatment of the Pamiri community as the fears were, of what would happen if Sunni extremists crossed from Afghanistan. So it doesn't even make sense. It defies logic. Not that logic is a word I use very often with the Tajik government and their moves, but like I said, it just doesn't. On so many levels, this is one of the most horrible things I think I've ever seen in all my time covering Central Asia. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Bruce. Well, Suzanne linked it to Russia's war in Ukraine, and it seems to be we have the same timing. Yeah, Russia doing this kind of strategically unjustified thing, right? Like shooting itself in both legs, and the Tajik regime doing the same. How do you see the Russian factor in this situation?
Well, I'm gonna have to agree with Suzanne that there's obviously some kind of quid pro quo going on here. Tajikistan, of all the Central Asian states, I think Tajikistan is the one that you could that it's most deserves the title of being a Russian lackey. Right, they've been dependent upon Russia since independence. Russia has had a military base there the whole time. Russia is a leading trade partner. They really call a lot of the shots. People say, "Well, the Chinese influence is growing." Yes, it is. But all the same, Russia is the dominant foreign influence in Tajikistan. I have also heard, of course, of the succession plans. At this point, and I also know that Putin personally didn't like Rustam Emomali as a candidate to replace his father. In fact, during that brief period that Putin was prime minister, he was speaking with Rahman one time and had mentioned that if Russia didn't like who the leader of Tajikistan was, they would be able to replace him quickly enough. So this is the situation they're in. Now, the timing, as you mentioned, it suggests that there was something particular about the moment. And I would imagine that this is because Russia was already starting to lose any friends and allies that it had. And all of a sudden, a country like Tajikistan became much more important to it because they knew that at the least, Tajikistan would keep quiet about this and possibly even give them certainly tacit support, but possibly even publicly give them a nod once in a while and that they were behind what Moscow was doing in Ukraine. So that might be part of the payout, the trade-off, and then in the meantime, they put the first son in as a leader with the same understanding that, just don't cross us and make sure you vote the right way, or at least abstain in the UN if it ever comes to that, those kind of things.
Thank you very much. Now, let me go to Steve. Steve, thanks a lot for joining us. Steve, how does the this dismal situation in Pamir affect the civil society in the rest of the country? My second question would be, there is international attention, right, to the situation, and we just had Mary Lolo, UN Special Rapporteur, giving these scathing remarks.
Yes.
So there is this attention, there is criticism. Does it have any effect, and can it have any effect? What's your take?
Well, first of all, apologies in advance for any background noise. I'm not used to giving presentations from airports, but if you hear a lot of noise, let me know and I'll repeat myself. But first of all, thank you to Nargis and to Harvard's Davis Center. This is a very timely event, and it's an honor to be with Susie and Bruce, whom I respect so greatly. And I'll absolutely get to the heart of your question. In a way, it sets up nicely what I was hoping to preview in my presentation, which was the question of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity, which is one of the most serious crimes in international law, not genocide, not war crimes, but crimes against humanity. And why am I going there? Susie and Bruce and I have done a number of these conversations about the terrible situation in Gabao. And I think as the worse it gets, the more the burden is on us as scholars, on us as lawyers and human rights defenders and experts to start naming things properly, identifying them in a way that could lead to some accountability. I think, and this may be provocative to go in this direction of talking about crimes against humanity, but I think first it's important because it helps define the scale, the scope, the severity of what we've seen, and Susie laid it out very nicely. But also, we really have a fear, and I think Bruce also said this, is that this could keep escalating, and this really could. It's not a coincidence that Genocide Watch has put out an alert that we're in what we could term the beginning stages of a genocide if we're speaking about Gabao. And more widely, as your question intimates, Nargis, this is a human rights crisis that affects the entire civil society in Tajikistan. And I was planning on touching on Mary Lawler's scathing press conference, which I think was a breath of fresh air in the Q&A a bit more. So let me, if I may, just lay out the definition very quickly of what crimes against humanity are and say that, I think that they apply. We have this concept from the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, Article 7. It says that crimes against humanity consist of specific criminal acts such as murder, massacres. I'm only listing the ones that are relevant to Gabao. Torture, deportation, persecution, extrajudicial punishment, summary execution, kidnapping, forced disappearance, unjust imprisonment, political repression, racial discrimination, religious persecution. I mean, I just listed acts which we've seen in this past year, unprecedented crackdown, and they reach the threshold. This is the important part. Something reaches the level of a crime against humanity when it's committed as part of a widespread, that's the important word, or systematic, it's the other important word, attack directed against any civilian population according to a state or organizational policy. And I think what Susie laid out so well, and Bruce did as well, is that what we've seen in Gabao unfold requires the coordination and the orchestration of so many branches of the Tajik government, from the Supreme Court, this rash of 6 convictions we just saw in recent days of journalists, human rights defenders, community leaders. That's one branch of the government, which is coordinating with another branch, let's say the Ministry of Communications, which is shutting down the internet. Then, of course, the other branch of government, the military, the security services, the police. There's so much about this campaign, which is orchestrated, which is systematic and widespread, that I think we reached that threshold. The other thing that's important here is, let's not forget, and again, Susie did this well, we had not just one person killed, we had over 40 in the Rushan events. We've had, Susie, is it over 200 detained? I mean, we're talking about hundreds of detained. So we've got,
I have 100.
Could be, I think you might have said close to the 500.
No, I'll just briefly,
right.
I've heard of 300 detained, 160 are documented very clearly, and over 500 have fled.
Right. And, other important things about this is crimes against humanity don't have to be committed in a time of war. That's what makes them different than crimes against humanity. And here's what's really important. You don't need to prove that the Tajik government has a specific intent of destroying the Pamiri identity. Although, these are very related concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity. And, Pamir Watch put out a very excellent report a few weeks ago, or maybe even longer, stating that what we've seen in one phase in the summer was an accelerated campaign of cultural assimilation, suppression of religious belief, as Susie again said, suppression of the language. And so we've got all these pieces, but we do not need, in order to get to the level of crimes against humanity, we do not need to prove that Rahman wants to wipe out the Pamiri identity. But as I was looking for analogies to this situation, and that's where it gets interesting when we think about when we start to confront, Tajikistan, as you said, Nargis, it's not on the headlines enough. That's why your event is so important. It's sandwiched between two permanent members of the Security Council that would veto any discussion of atrocity crimes, both in their own jurisdictions, but also in Central Asia. That's one of the reasons Tajikistan has, eluded these discussions or the gaze of the international lawyers. But that's why it's important to find these analogies. So I was looking at the situations of Western Tigray, which has been classified as crimes against humanity, the Uyghurs, obviously, in China, in Xinjiang, also the Janjaweed militias, Darfur, and a few other examples. But what's really interesting in the parallels, let's say if you take the Ethiopian case and the Tajik case, you have a case where Gabao is about Rahmon asserting political control over an entire autonomous region. The word autonomous is in the name of Gabao. And he may not have had the stated intent, or he may not have been carrying out this parade of horrors with the specific intent or out of, I should say, racial animosity. But as he's encountered more resistance from the Pamiri people, the methods of violence, the campaign of arrests have escalated in a way that is somewhat similar to this Western Tigray region, for example, where we've seen the Amhara militias, the Ethiopian military, escalating their pattern of arrests and violence and killings. So that's really concerning. And I think, again, that's a reason why it's important to call this crimes against humanity, because we have a real risk of this spiraling out of control into perhaps a genocide. And I can get more into some of the specifics, but just to state the obvious, because it wouldn't, if as a lawyer, I would be committing malpractice, so I didn't consider the basic question: can you actually try this crime that I'm throwing out there, which is so provocative? Well, yes, you can. Unlike Uzbekistan, for example, Tajikistan actually signed the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998. It ratified it in 2000. So actually, the ICC does have jurisdiction over this potential case. That puts aside the question of another domestic court like Germany, that could also prosecute what's happening to the Pamiris under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which is another avenue, of course. Of course, the problem is, as I said, the Security Council would never let this happen. You have both Russia and China. And so you would need to see the assertion of authority under maybe the UN General Assembly, but you have seen that happening increasingly in cases, for example, like Syria, where the General Assembly, in lieu of action from the Security Council, takes a step and starts collecting evidence of atrocities in Syria. So that's an interesting example. But just really quickly, and then I'll see if you have a follow-up, is the elements of systematic and widespread, just to sort of make my case clear. We have the systematic campaign of arrests of community leaders, lawyers, journalists, opinion leaders, informal leaders, Commission 44, human rights defenders. We have the systematic blockage of communication throughout the sustained internet blockages, which have all, as I said, escalated over time, gotten worse, gotten longer. Killing of civilians, large groups of them, arrests of hundreds. Judicial processes which are closed, inordinately lengthy sentences, as we've been seeing, 30 years, 15 years. These are the longest in Central Asia. And as folks know, this is what I sort of spend my time doing, is looking at lengthy prison sentences, 30 years for Faramuz Ziragashev just days ago. And then this credible evidence of systematic torture in places of detention. And I think, one other interesting related question to this crimes against humanity is, which crime against humanity are we going to try? Is it the campaign against the Pamiris? Is it for a practice and policy of torture writ large in Tajikistan's prisons, which doesn't only affect the Pamiri activists, but has affected the IRPT, has affected business leaders, political opposition from other parties like the Social Democratic Party of Tajikistan? Or would we look at this campaign of transnational repression as a separate crime against humanity, perhaps? So there's overlapping crimes against humanity that we can look at. Maybe I'll stop there because I've gone on for a long time, but suffice to say that this legalese that I'm spewing here is not what's really important. What's important, I think, is that we've reached a threshold where what we've seen in Gabao is really important to humanity, and it requires action. And so that's why I think Mary Lawler's stinging and fiery remarks just a few days ago were so important. And I hope that this jolts us into some action, and we can get a few cases underway.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Steve. Let me ask a couple of questions based on what you said to the panel, and also start introducing the questions we receive online. Well, from your remarks, it seems that the government efforts are well coordinated. There is a coherence, right? And I was wondering if we do see any fragmentation or potential fragmentation inside the kind of state apparatus, the political elites. Well, both Suzanne and Bruce talked about the political succession, going on potentially. For times like these, the cohesion, fragmentation of the political elites is of major importance, right? So do we see kind of Tajikistan's political elites as coherent or not? And I think that we a little bit touched upon that when we discussed the Kyrgyz-Tajik border conflict. It was clear who initiated, what was the logic of it, what was the rationale during the SCO summit. You do something like that. So that would be the first question to the panel: coherence versus fragmentation. And the second one, Steve, you talked about these the ongoing suppression attempts to eliminate cultural and religious identities, and we know about the role that Aga Khan Foundation played in kind of supporting these identities. So what do we know about the Aga Khan reaction to these horrible things going on in Gbao? One of our guests mentions that recently Tajik foreign minister met with the Aga Khan officials in Paris. So if you what do you know? What are your thoughts on this? So coherence versus fragmentation, and then the Aga Khan Foundation. Who wants to start?
Let me just make a quick comment. I think both panelists are better than me on both of these questions, but I just want to say that I think that certainly from my perspective, following the human rights crackdown over the years, it's interesting how there's been this cat and mouse game. Sometimes there was rivalry between the security services and the MVD, the police. We saw some teams being tasked with playing nice, with enticing political dissidents to come back to the country. We had one individual named, I think it's Shahrukh Saida, Bruce, maybe you'll correct me, but you had, and then you had a team forming under the president's son for a while that was also saying that it was going to play nice. And I mean, they did successfully entice some of the political dissidents to come back to the country. Like we had one case of Sabir Valiyev, used to be a member of Group 24. Then he comes back to the country. He's been enticed by the team that was sort of playing nice, trying to win them over, promised them a putative opposition. And what would be interesting to know is in the wake of the Kyrgyzstan-Tajik conflict, in the wake of this terrible crackdown, where does this stand? Has President Rahmon has effectively stamped this out? Yatim of, I know, Susie, I was losing some of my connection when you were mentioning him and his changing position. So, but I did want to just make one comment, which is I think one of the ways we ferret out the rivalries, one of the ways we make them squirm is by starting to initiate sanctions against the officials responsible for this crackdown in Gbao. And I think you'll start to see some regime defections. I think you'll start to see some really interesting political fallout, which could be helpful in addition to the need to actually punish these individuals that are responsible for the crimes. So I'll let the others, which are much more equipped to answer that.
Thank you, Steve. Suzanne, can I go to you?
Yeah, I'm just going to answer the coherence fragmentation question, then I'll briefly go into what I know about the AKF. So in terms of the fragmentation, I've kind of broken it down to several layers of fragmentation. Or I shouldn't say fragmentation, but competition. So I do think Shahrukh and Unit 6 are kind of under Rustam Imamali's control. And so when you saw Unit 6, which is Sharukh's, who is his title is the head of the, I believe, anti-organized crime unit. Is that correct? I think that's what it is. But he has a special, like special forces called Unit 6, and they do a lot of the interrogation and torture. And so Rustam, from what I understand, is in control or advised by one of his key advisors, is Sharukh Saeedzadeh. And then you have Yatimov and the generals who have a competition within the country, the head of the GKNB. And the interesting thing about the former Central Asian countries and the former Soviet Union is the one thing that kind of remained intact is the KGB network. So for example, Yatimov still partners with Tashev in Kyrgyzstan on the drug trafficking. They remain in touch. Yatimov remains in touch with the head of the intelligence services in Uzbekistan. So there's this sort of network that Russia does support, from what I understand, quite a bit. Don't know. Again, a lot of this is speculation and based on many interviews. So there's that competition. Then there's a very important sort of spoiler in all this, which is one of the president's daughters, Firuza, married Sahibov. And Sahibov is a very wealthy businessman who also owns a lot of gyms. And under those gyms, from what I understand, there are trained fighters, which are kind of potential militias. And so Sahibov's extreme financial power, you know, whoever is, and then there's a Zada as well, one of the president's other daughters, who's quite powerful within the family. And they don't all agree with each other by any means. There's competition among all these groups in major ways. And Sahibov, it kind of, whoever he chooses, in my opinion, could actually push whoever might be the successor in that. So I think that's important to try to understand. And the competition, you know, I think nobody wants to see it fall apart like, you know, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. So you really have to hope that if there is a succession, that there is a way that somehow the government stays intact without continuing what Steve has so clearly explained, you know, continuing the crimes against humanity that are going on. Then also briefly, all I know about that meeting in Paris with the representatives, the Yaga Khan and the foreign minister, is again from one source, so not a trusted source, but not fully vetted. I mean, I don't have other sources. Is that there was 270 million that was going to be given to Tajikistan by the AKDN for development funding. And the question from AKDN representatives was, how much of it is it going to Gorno-Badakhshan? The answer from the foreign minister was none, $0. Majority is going to Dangra area and a little bit to Sugd. And that then, from what I understand, AKDN said, okay, not funding. Now, this is, of course, on the heels of the government of Tajikistan closing down various AKDN programs, as well as seizing numerous properties that belong to AKDN, including the park that they built into, I'm not going to go through all the properties, but they've seized a bunch of properties and they have closed all kinds of programming. So, but that's all I know about that in terms of there being some pressure from AKDN because of this funding that they are holding back. But I don't have confirmation on that. And I just also want to say thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here, Nargiz and the Davis Center, and with Bruce and Steve. I apologize for not saying that right at the front there.
Yeah, thank you from us. Bruce, do you have thoughts on this?
You know, just real briefly, you know, Tajikistan, it's has, of course, problems with its northern border and Kyrgyzstan and the southern border with Afghanistan. If succession is coming, and it almost surely is, let's face it, Rahman just marked 30 years as the head of Tajikistan a few weeks back. We know even for years now that there would probably be a lot of resistance to him putting his son as president, right? I mean, even in 2015, when the campaign against the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan started, that was one of the theories, was he was clearing the field of any potential competitors in opposition to the move, right? Which makes sense, of course, because the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan I mentioned they had 40,000 registered members, but a lot of people thought that there was more, like 200,000 or 300,000 at least, people who supported that party. So he's done that in 2015. And now here's the one place he's not sure of within his country that he has control over. He can't control what happens that much along the Kyrgyz border or the Afghan border. But he can control to some extent, to a greater extent anyway, what's going on in Gorno-Badakhshan. And if he's worried that people in the country won't accept the transfer of power from father to son, it could be a flashpoint. I don't think that the people in Gorno-Badakhshan could successfully oppose the transfer of power, but if they came out and protested, it might encourage other people in other places in the country to also come out and protest against that move. So this was a way of just further clearing the field, and really that was the last place that he probably had to worry about when he does his succession. The Aga Khan, it's a shame that this is even happening, because the Aga Khan's the only one that paid any attention to that region at all, practically. I mean, almost no money from state budget of Tajikistan goes to Gorno-Badakhshan. If it wasn't for the Aga Khan, they wouldn't have power plants. They wouldn't have the bridges that connected them with Afghanistan in friendlier times, roads, hybrid crops that they grow, things like that. I mean, the Aga Khan has really done all these things. Of course, the university that's up there in Horog also is his doing. The Tajik government at this point probably doesn't care that much about the fate of the Pamiris in Gorno-Badakhshan. Not that they probably ever did too much, but we know that the road is being improved to China, and they might have got a better deal from the Chinese on this. Or whatever is happening up there, they figured that the Aga Khan's help is not as important as what they're going to get from China once this road opens up. Because again, this road, it's part of the multimodal system that the road connects to a railway that just opened in Kulab, I believe, in southern Tajikistan. It goes all the way through Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran to Turkey. So this has the potential to be a much greater trade route than it has been to this point. And that might just look like a better deal to the government than having to deal with the Aga Khan, who they've all, let's face it, the Pamiris idolize the Aga Khan rightly. They're the followers of the Aga Khan. But if you look at the literature on state media in Tajikistan, they're supposed to be, revering the great founder of the peace and all that Rahman is. So it's probably unwanted competition on Imam Ali Rahman's part.
We talked about Russia and China. How about other actors, EU, US? There is a question about the US assistance, security assistance to Tajik security services. How does that, whether it's linked to the crackdown in one way or another? The EU was thinking about providing assistance for building Rogun, right? So do they have any leverage? How much leverage do they have? And so what the role they play or they can play in Tajikistan?
Well, maybe I'll start and say that the EU Human Rights Dialogue, which is a bilateral consultation, occurred just a week ago, days before Ufat Khanim Mamadchoeva gets 21 years, and Manucher Holik Nazarov, a human rights lawyer I've worked with for many, many years, gets 15 years. And again, we've seen for years and years in Central Asia how the EU Human Rights Dialogue has never really served human rights, never really been an effective tool. But now there's such a paltry disregard, and that's not my term, that's minority rights group, I think, use that language to describe the Tajik government's its attitude towards the EU and its whole human rights dialogue. The idea that you can have a press release come out with no consequences, with no even hinting at the possibility of targeted sanctions, when just a few countries away, you have the EU imposing targeted sanctions on Iran, on Iranian officials for the same types of human rights violations. What it does is it just shows the utterly, and I think Olivier Ferrando's question is absolutely right, this transactional relationship that has become so much of a pattern, of a habit, and old habits die hard. I mean, Bruce would say that, I think you will say in a few moments, Bruce, that this has been the prevailing way of doing business with Central Asia since 9/11. And so we're now in the 21st year of this way of doing business. That's why it was so interesting that in her press conference, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawler, said that she wasn't just upset with the Tajik authorities. She didn't just say that they were acting disgracefully. She said, when I get back to Brussels, I'm going to meet with the EU envoy for human rights, Eamon Gilmore, and I'm going to give him a piece of my mind, because what I find remarkable, she says, is that when human rights defenders in Tajikistan are under threat, when they can see a mile away that an arrest is coming, they go to the website, to the EU embassy, they go to the German embassy, they go to the US embassy, and they can't get a visa. So things that need to happen now are making humanitarian visas more available to people that need them in Tajikistan, making evacuation more of an option. And I think that, when it comes to the United States, I think it's since 2016. So since the IRPT was banned as a party, you have the US Commission for International Religious Freedom designating Tajikistan as a country of particular concern. Now that's interesting because the CPC designation is a recommendation that the US government sanction and freeze military assistance to Tajikistan. But the White House can override that designation on national security grounds. And that's what they've done, indeed. That's what the Pentagon has done. It's very, very familiar to those of us that looked at the Northern Distribution Network in Uzbekistan, but Tajikistan gets less notice on this account. The United States keeps waiving potential sanctions. And so I think what this potential genocide, these crimes against humanity should do is really stop this policy of the EU and the US of doing business as usual. And that means freezing military assistance. It means freezing assets, denying visas, considering targeted sanctions, and then hopefully, as I said, support for these international justice accountability mechanisms. Sorry for such a long answer, Nargis.
Yeah, from the human rights perspective, I think the prescription is, what you outlined is clear and valid. But if you're a policymaker, what are the kind of realistic options? Do you impose sanctions and kind of denounce and all that? But that, I guess, would mean disengagement, right, from Tajikistan, or do you try to kind of play a game? So not being extremely harsh, but at the same time kind of trying to stay in the region and do something there. So what are the options out there? I don't know if who wants to. Yeah, Susan.
Susie, we're going to say something there? I wanted to.
Well, I saw you jump in, so it's okay. If you have something
just real quick, lest people walk away from the talk thinking that the human rights guy is always the non-realist or the. I do think that what you get if you allow this to continue in the way it is, U.S. policy and EU policymakers won't have a choice. They will have to eventually respond as this gets worse. And we saw days ago, I noticed that the US government just sanctioned Azerbaijani government officials. Perhaps I think it may be the first Azerbaijani official on the global Magnitsky list. And this is a country that, as we know, is producing oil that's badly needed in the wake of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And so that ability to not disengage Nargis, but I think principally engage in a principled way. That's what I think we can do.
Which brings back the question of leverage, right? What is the leverage that Europeans can have, Americans can have, other actors with principled foreign policies have? Suzanne, you wanted to say something?
Well, two things, and thanks, Steve, for the really well stated discussion about that. I think that leverage is hard right now because China is infusing so much money. When you think about the Pamir Highway, the moment they cleared those leaders from Khorog and killed them, suddenly there was a $200 million funding for the Pamir Highway. So from China. So it's the leverage is very difficult right now. And what I've seen over and over is one hand is saying, oh, the US embassy is sort of stating there are human rights abuses going on. And then the other hand has CENTCOM leader coming, or Germany says there's human rights abuses, and then they suddenly are negotiating an energy deal. And that's been going on and on. So they are trying this carrot and stick approach, which isn't working really at all. But if they pull everything from the region, and I'm in agreement in the realist framework with Steve, we don't have a hand in the game anymore. Then we're just out. And then there's no human rights oversight, and then there's nothing. So how do you balance that? And I do think a very sort of targeted, principled engagement, more engagement, not less. I totally agree with that. For example, the refugees. I've been working on this refugee issue day and night behind the scenes, and there are so many refugees who need visas. And getting those visas takes the Pamiri diaspora working behind the scenes, hundreds of people working behind the scenes to rescue people, to get visas, just to get basic food and housing until they can get there. And I do think the international community could jump in immediately with helping with that, with the visas, with the transit visas, with the support, with all of that, because that's not going on. It's almost like an underground railroad of trying to save Pamiris from numerous countries, both from extradition from those countries or from Tajikistan. So I think it could be a two-pronged approach. They could both help the refugees, they could call out these crimes against humanity, and at the same time increase engagement. And I haven't thought about this enough, like the principled engagement. I think, Steve, we should talk about that more. I'd like to discuss that more, because I think that's a good way to look at it. Thanks.
Bruce?
Yeah, well, not to sound like a hawk or anything, but for the last couple of years, I've always been kind of a supporter of why don't we just cut them off certainly from funding or any help, in Tajikistan. I don't, on the face of it, just looking at it on paper, it doesn't make much sense to have to support this government. I mean, if you are the US or NATO or something, you can easily make the case that for 20 years plus, you were the ones that were providing security that really helped keep Tajikistan and greater Central Asia from these problems. Also, China and Russia benefited from that too, that the war was confined to Afghanistan. It didn't spread anywhere else. If China and Russia, they criticized US policy when the US was in Afghanistan, and they still have lots of criticisms now that the US is out. It's more immediately a threat to China and Russia. And if Tajikistan is really in that bad of a shape that it's going to go down the tubes, then there's a Russian military base there, and there's a small Chinese military base there too. And why not? Why didn't Tajikistan, just turn to them and we'll let them loose, and go back to where it was in the 1990s, where the U.S. is trying to promote democratic institutions and sovereignty at the same time in these countries, and say you're not meeting any of our levels. So we're going to cut back funding and cut back our relations with your government. I don't, like I said, I understand the argument that Tajikistan is one of those countries that's too important to fail because of where it's located, because Afghanistan's to the south. But with Chinese and Russian help, they ought to be able to keep themselves up. Now, that said, I do not know what security agreements some of these governments have with Tajikistan. When the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and was pulling out, there was a lot of talk about this over the horizon stuff, right? Obviously, this is nothing that's going to be in print and nothing that anyone's going to talk about, but I've wondered many times since the Taliban returned to power, what exactly the U.S.-Tajik relationship is at the moment. And if for no other reason than We know that Tajikistan is the only country that is openly against the Taliban being in power. There's many suspicions that the group of Ahmed Massoud, the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, is receiving aid that comes through Tajikistan. And we know that when Tajik president came out against the Taliban right away, got an invitation to come to France, meet with President Macron. So, like I said, there's things going that we don't see, and that's why it's really hard for me to criticize the way that the EU and the US are approaching it, because there's a lot, clearly some secret agreements going on here. When you look at it and what's happening, I don't see the problem in cutting back and just saying our interests are not your interests. We have called on you. We have given you aid. You are a donor-dependent country, and we've done what we can for 30 years. And if your best response, as we saw last week with the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders in the region, with the EU delegation meeting, if your best response is to convict and and sentence people to lengthy prison terms while all this is going on, then we really don't have enough common interest that we need to pursue this relationship on the level it's been going on for so many years.
Yeah, but how do you keep a lifeline to the society, to the civil society of the country?
I understand that, and I agree that we still should help them. We also know that so much of the aid that goes to Tajikistan is soaked up, especially financial aid, is siphoned off by government officials. This is always a really hard position to be in. And I mean, even 20 years ago, my attitude was kind of the same. And then that was the response that people gave me. They're like, but what about the people who are getting help from this? And I agree, USAID, people like that, you want to get wheat shipments through, you want to help with water purification programs, you want to do all that stuff. But while you're doing that, you're also helping the leadership prolong its presence too, because you're solving problems they should be responsible for solving. So the basic things that would normally make people rise up and revolt are cleared up by Western aid instead. So you prolong the regime's lifeline in these countries. And like I said, it's a real tough balancing act. And I understand it's a really unpopular argument that I'm making. But Tajikistan, like I said, essentially thumbed its nose at the Western community last week when it sends those 6 people. At a time when they had all kinds of representatives there, they just ignored any of these calls for change or mercy. And so how do you get the message across to somebody like that? There will be a day. If Russia's going to emerge weaker from the war in Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. There's going to be a period where Russia cannot be provide the kind of support it's provided to Tajikistan all these years. At that point, it would be in Tajikistan's best interest, the Tajik government's best interest, to have great ties with Western countries, but they're really burning their bridges here. And that has to be a message that comes across to them, is we don't want to let down your people. We want to help your people. But you, Tajik government, are not doing anything that helps us to build bridges and communicate and keep in touch with you. And that has to change.
Yes, indeed. Bruce, you already started us with predictions, and that's something I wanted to ask the panelists to to give us, if possible. It's the end of the year, the time of predictions. What would be your predictions for the next year or two?
Again, not knowing some of these agreements that Western countries have that more concerning Afghanistan than Tajikistan, it's kind of hard. I would hope that the U.S. would be, and European countries, Western countries would really put it on Tajikistan and start withholding aid that's been promised. The EU just said that, there's a special partnership deal that Tajikistan is up for. And they said, unless we see progress in your record on human rights and democracy, we can't sign the agreement with you. That's exactly what you should be doing. I'm not suggesting they should cut ties with them at all, but these things have to be conditional. And say, we recognize that you need this help. We're happy to give it to you, but there has to be some quid pro quo here. And that's just the way it is. We can't support a government that is going in the direction of Turkmenistan for years now. And then there has to be some visible change in what's going on and the way your country is run, especially with the succession coming up, where is everyone supposed to support the royal kid when he gets in, because Tajikistan is too important to fail, or can they say, we don't, you have to have free and fair elections, knowing that's impossible. But you know, really put some pressure on and say, fine, you're going to put the kid in, but you know, you have to make some changes, or we just can't do business like we've been doing it for the last 3 decades. That's not going to work anymore. And if you need help, then why don't you turn to your Chinese and Russian friends and see what happens when questions of sovereignty and territorial integrity come up in the future, because you won't get as good a deal with them as you certainly you wouldn't get as much support for sovereignty from China and Russia as you will from Western nations.
So you think that the crackdown will continue? And
yeah, unfortunately,
the succession can actually take place in the near future.
They might be able to do it. You know, I think the succession will happen. I think they've stamped out most of the domestic potential domestic opposition. The problem with getting them to change these kind of policies is they've been able to get away with it for so long. There has to be something has to happen to show them this is the penalty for this, you know, so that they get the message.
Thank you. Suzanne, can we go to you?
Sure. You know, I just have to comment on the conditional requirements for any development. I actually completely agree with Bruce on that. I think that when you have the Unit 6 of Shahrukh, who are the torturers, interrogators trained by the US with US equipment, et cetera, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we've trained the perpetrators of violence in the country. I mean, other countries have too, but we have majorly, and I understand. I've been in Afghanistan a lot, you know, that we did it in partnership to be able to have access to Afghanistan. And so we have that partnership, but I do think that we could, and I don't know what the secret agreements are, not a clue, but I do know that, you know, there's the potential for curtailing agreements based on human rights violations and crimes against humanity. So I just want to say that. I don't know what the principled engagement could be and the conditional engagement could be. I think that really needs to be thought about and discussed. And I'm going to be thinking about that quite a bit myself at this point forward. But in terms of what's going on in the future, I do think there's going to be succession. I think I laid out the different groups that are competing for that succession. I don't think it's already a foregone conclusion that Rustam is going to be the successor, because I do not think that Xi Jinping or Putin agree with him at this point, in my opinion. So I think that there's potential for some real jockeying from power and some potential instability. I think the crackdowns will continue. I think the crackdowns are not so much crackdowns anymore as a methodical destruction of Pamiri culture and society. And I completely agree both with Bruce's characterization of cultural genocide, Genocide Watch's characterization, and how Steve laid it out incredibly meticulously, which I so appreciate. We need lawyers, always need lawyers. And I think that, so the crackdowns will continue. And I think the question of Aga Khan Foundation and AKDN funding is really important, because most families do gain economically in the region from them. And most of the programming is funded by them. So who's going to pick up the slack if they're not there? That would be a pretty big disaster. So, and then one last thing I'll say is, if the crackdowns continue and this happens, and let's say Tajikistan does become a pariah state because crimes against humanity are brought and whatnot, the question is, you know, will China ramp up the support, because they're doing the same thing with the Uyghurs, and become a de facto, you know, overlord, which is what I think could easily happen. And then I think you go back to Bruce's, you know, is that what you really want, Tajikistan? Because I know that President Ramon has always liked to play all sides to maintain independence. How much independence are you going to get with China if you've decided to make that deal? So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Steve?
Well, those those predictions were very comprehensive and excellent. And just for the record, I'd say that I also agree with a lot of what Bruce was saying about the conditionality. Conditionality is also a favorite word for the human rights community. And let me quote Susanna, or let me record you saying that lawyers are needed. That was lovely. But I'll say, I think we're going to see, as everyone has said, the crackdown getting worse. Just days ago, I heard from a journalist that fled from Kulob, from, again, close to Dangara, close to the heart of President Rahmon's power. I think he's so paranoid. He's going to continue to stamp out all manifestations of dissent, even from areas of the country which, were previously considered loyal. So we know that there's a crackdown in Garm. There's been operations in other areas over the years. Ever since sort of 2007, 2008, we've seen this steady operations against the former opposition from during the Civil War. So I think we're going to continue to see cases, maybe in Hujand. Certainly we'll probably see, unfortunately, prosecutions of the human rights defenders that Mary Lawler was able to meet with that are so deathly afraid that many of them, eschew the term human rights defender. They no longer, for example, when an international NGO wants to go to the ground and meet with these folks, sometimes the only option to have a confidential conversation is to invite them to a foreign embassy. And that's contingent on someone like, the German ambassador saying, hey, I support human rights. I'm going to open up my embassy for this sort of safe space, but that doesn't always happen. So I fear that you will have more prosecutions over the coming year of individual human rights defenders, journalists, the ones that are left. Also, maybe one other piece to add to the excellent picture that Bruce and Susie just painted is that it's been, and I think this was the name of one of your recent podcasts, Bruce, it's been a terrible year for Central Asia on the whole, right? We had bloody Kazakhstan, bloody January, then we had Karakalpakstan, we have Gabao throughout the year. And what does that tell us? That tells us that 2023 is going to be much worse. We're waiting for Mirziyoyev's constitutional referendum next door to reinstal him as president. And so if we have that, overlapping cycles of authoritarianism building upon each other, that is just going to be very bad for human rights overall. And it's going to mean that we have to get creative. So I also hope, my hopeful prediction is that you'll see some creative lawyering. You'll see maybe some, again, sanctions petitions filed, crimes against humanity cases, at least reports written, steps taken in order to raise the cost for what's happening. And you'll have civil society and the diaspora, the Pamiri diaspora, which has been so courageous, so impressive. And I just want to applaud the ones that are on this call. They will continue to do the work they're doing, and we should just help them in whatever way we can. So that's what I predict, both realistically, pessimistically, and optimistically.
Thank you, Steve. Suzanne? Yes.
I just need to add one thing. I saw a question in the chat, which is very important in terms of what can be done. Both the visas for the refugees. The other issue is there are 3 lists of Tajiks and Pamiris with the Interpol right now that the Tajik government has given them, which means that refugees seeking status are on these red lists. And there are 2 ways to get them off the list. One, they can request to find out. Any individual can request if they're on the list. And if they are on the list, they can then request getting off the list by telling them their case. So I would urge Interpol to really look carefully at these lists, because some Tajiks have been sent back to the country because they're on these lists by various foreign countries and not gotten humanitarian visas or asylum status. So that's a very important piece that could be quickly and easily done.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it has been a tough year for Central Asia. We started with the January events in Kazakhstan, and we're finishing with this discussion on crackdown in Pamir. And it does seem that autonomies in the region are not faring very well. And I think about Xinjiang, think about Kyrgyzstan now, Gabao as well. There is something going on, and we need to think how autonomies can be accommodated without assimilation, without efforts to assimilate them or kind of basically undermine their autonomy. I think one thing we definitely should do is to keep an eye on the situation, to follow what's going on closely. And I want to thank the three of you. I want to thank Suzanne, Bruce, and Steve for not only watching, for not only caring, but being actively engaged and trying to help. And it's somewhat sad to end the year with this very sad discussion. But well, what can you do? Such is life. But let me finish it by thanking you, thanking the audiences, and also wishing you all the best for next year. Let's hope we'll see some good trends and some good developments in the region. The hope dies last. So let's see. It's a very dynamic scene. That's for sure. Last but not least, let me thank our events team at the Davis Center, especially Laura Sargent, who made this event possible.